Hello, my name is Billie J. Wonderwood. I'm one of the Baldwin County Commissioners. I'm actually from District 3, which is the central Baldwin area, and I'm here today with the Campbell family from Robertsdale. Recently, brothers Bruce Campbell and George Campbell, also known as Uncle George, have passed away and left us. And I was recently at Uncle George's funeral, and I just heard all the wonderful stories about his life and his brother's life and the impact that they have made on the central Baldwin area. And I wanted to be sure that we did not lose these stories. And so I am here today with Ruthie Campbell, and I am here with her son, Kyle Irwin. Tell me, what was it like growing up around such legendary cowboys?
Well, I'll kind of sneak in and steal this question from my mom, because the cowboy, side of the family between the two brothers, I sure inherited that. It was really unique. The stories that you heard throughout the town, a local place that everybody's so familiar with, Mac and Jerry's, is where we got to hear a lot of those stories. But to watch these two men, and I got to see them later in their life, and Mom will go into their younger days and the stories that she heard, but to watch these two men in their older age, the impact they still had in the cattle and the farming industry in this town, the heritage that this town and this county brought to the state of Alabama, much less this area, to hear the stories and to know that the impact that they had, their father, Bill Campbell, had, that he passed down to them, it was always very unique. It brought pride to me. I always wore that with pride, the stories I was able to tell. The long hours at the stockyard, the long hours you heard about them in the farming in the fields, it was always something special to us, special to me. I know it's special to Mom, but I think the story building up to all that is more unique. So I'll let her kind of tell you a little bit about their childhood. One that's so crazy is where they were born and how they never lived more than a mile from that, the fields that they worked, the dairy that we had here. It's real unique. So I'll let Mom kind of elaborate on those a little bit.
Thank you, Kyle. So that's what I'll do. In the beginning, when my grandfather and the family came down, they came from Chilton County, and they moved here when he was 9 years old. He was born in 1911. They moved here when he was 9. It was December of 1920, which makes our family here 101 years, 1 year before the city of Robertsdale was incorporated. This is a picture of my great-grandfather and his wife, my great-grandmother, Emily Campbell. And this was the couple that moved from Jemison, Alabama, in Chilton County to Baldwin County here in Robertsdale, December 1920. They came with their 8 children and made their home in Robertsdale. This is a lineage tree of the Campbell family, beginning with Chief Minowa, the chief of Horseshoe Bend. After the war at Horseshoe Bend, he walked the Trail of Tears, and the lineage goes straight through to my grandfather, William Campbell. This is a paper that was sent from Washington, D.C. regarding where our family was proven to have walked the Trail of Tears, and allotments of land was awarded to our family, and we received money for it. This is a picture of my great-grandfather, Josh Campbell, my grandfather, Bill Campbell, and my daddy, Bruce. This is my great-grandfather, Josh Campbell, and he's 92 years old. He lived to see his 95th birthday and then passed on the same day. This picture is my great-grandfather, Josh Campbell, and this is in 1965, just a very few short years before he did pass away. This picture is my grandfather, Bill Campbell. This picture is made outside of the 2-story red brick home on Highway 59, right on the property where the Waffle House is today. This is a picture of my grandfather, Bill Campbell, and his 2 boys, George and Bruce. They're pictured at the first home that they owned, the home that the boys were both born in. This is a picture in 1944, my grandmother, Lucille Campbell, with my daddy, Bruce. He's almost 2 years old. This is also in front of the first home that they purchased that he was born in. This picture is also in that same first home where George and Bruce are little toddlers. This picture is my grandfather, Bill Campbell, and this picture is made in the field beside their home, which is right on the same property where Robertsdale High School sits today. This is a picture of Bruce, my daddy. He's standing out in front of the home on 59, getting ready to go to school at 7 years old. This is a picture of Bruce standing on his little go-kart right in Robertsdale on Highway 59. The next few pictures are of an amusement park ride that my grandfather Bill bought for his boys and his girls and all the neighborhood kids. This is a picture of Bruce playing cowboys and Indians, and he's the cowboy. This is a picture of Bruce on one of his little horses right at the red brick home on 59 in the parking lot behind the Waffle House. This is a picture of the old dairy barn in Robertsdale that sits on the same property that the Coliseum, Baldwin County Coliseum, sits on today. It was in their hay barn, just the other room, the other side of the dairy barn. This is a picture at Pirates Cove in Alberta when all the kids would go and swim when they would have Sunday outings. This picture is a picture from shore showing the long pier and the slide that all the kids would load up on and slide down on all at one time. This is a certificate that was awarded to Uncle George in 2019 from 25 years of service in the Masonic Lodge in Robertsdale. He began September 6th of 1966 and went 22 years straight, and then due to the farm, just couldn't make any more meetings and started back 3 years before he passed and earned his 25-year degree. This certificate was Bill Campbell's. He was a Shriner in Mobile, Alabama, with his first day being August the 9th of 1951. For many years he was a Shriner and loved it dearly. This is a picture in 1986. My grandparents, Bill and Lucille Campbell, went and took the family to Olin Mills for portraits. This is a flyer of my grandfather's Bill Campbell, who ran for constable, and for 32 consecutive years he was constable in Baldwin County. And this is a certificate from the state of Alabama signed by Governor Fob James, December 18th of 1980. Having full faith and trust in your prudence, integrity, and ability, I do by virtue of the power and authority vested in me as Governor of the state of Alabama, hereby commission you to constable in Baldwin County. This newspaper was in the Independent newspaper Wednesday, May 13th of 1987, and this picture is of my daddy, Bruce, on his tractor, and he's putting out chemicals. At this point, there was some complaints in the city, and they approached the city council, and the reading states that at the meeting in city council chambers in Robertsdale, Alabama, Billy Newman, representing Degussa Corporation in Theodore, Alabama, Bruce Campbell, a local farmer, and county agent Donald Dunn came before the council to assure them the chemical is safe except for a rather strong smell. This chemical they did experiment with, and it was a wonderful fertilizer for the soil. A newspaper clipping that came out of the Gulf Coast Farmer on Wednesday, February the 14th of 1979 shows where the cucumbers were a main cash crop in the 1920s. And this picture in particular is the photograph. It was taken in June of 1923 at the cucumber patch of the Josh Campbell and Andy McDaniel families, and Josh Campbell being my great-grandfather. This picture was taken near Robertsdale, and then it reads the names of the people in the picture, and one of the small boys up front is my grandfather, Bill Campbell. And he came down, and he was a little boy. He attended Robertsdale School, as his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and now great-great-grandson is in Robertsdale Elementary. And over the years, he went back and forth and worked the coal mines a lot up in Piper, Alabama, in Bibb County. And he, when he came back, he and my grandmother married in 1933 and had 4 children. The first 2 were the boys. George was the oldest, and then my daddy, Bruce, was second. And they were born in the home that is actually just across the street from where we are right now. Wow. Uncle George was born in 1940 and my dad in 1942. And they lived there until they were 4 and 6. And then my grandfather built the 2-story red brick home on Highway 59 where the Waffle House sits now. And they were raised there in that home. Again, that's only a half a mile from where they were born to that home. So then in 1964, when my dad married, they moved to the home that's right next to this house in the same yard. And Uncle George, when he married, moved here in this home. And they both passed in this home in the last year, and so they only lived a half a mile from where they were born their entire lives. Daddy passed at 77, being Bruce, and George passed at the age of 80 this past year. So that's really unique in perspective in that sense. But they grew up working hard and learning all about the farm. My granddaddy purchased all this land that we're on now in the 30s, before Uncle George was born in 1940. And we still own this land. We own the 2 homes on this land, and then the 25 acres that adjoins it, where horses still are today that were, and cattle that were in the 30s whenever Papa purchased this. This was part of the dairy land where all the dairy cows stayed, and then the line of trees that are behind us, a good bit behind us, that was part of the swamp. All this was a cypress swamp, by the way. Okay. And on the other side of what's left of the swamp behind us, up to the corner and around where the Baldwin County Coliseum is at this time, was part of all the acreage that he owned and purchased in the 30s, and where all the cattle were that they milked. Where they lived on 59 was just a fast hop, skip, and jump over to where the dairy was. And my granddaddy would drive over, and my daddy was all about running. And he would just tear out as a little boy and run across the fields over to the dairy barn and beat Papa, bringing Uncle George over. And so they grew up on the dairy. They grew up on the dairy, and they grew up farming. And
so they knew what hard work was.
They knew what hard work was. That's all that they did know to do. Anything labor by hand, whether it fell into construction or dairying or farming, anything. Daddy learned to weld and taught himself, on the farm and with others helping. But he was the mechanic by all means. Something
that would be kind of neat to throw in there with this story, and you talk about the hard work. And I remember they'd always tell me when I was younger, and my eyes would get big, and I'd think, which now 12 buckets of water wouldn't be much to a 31-year-old man. But for the folks who, maybe don't remember this house, the 2-story brick house that she's talking about where the Waffle House now sits, still to this day, when you drive up and down 59, there's an old oak tree that sits by that Waffle House. There used to be 2 of them, and when they developed that land, they took one of them out, but that oak tree was planted by my great-grandfather. Both of those oak trees were, and he made Bruce and George every day carry 12 buckets of water to each one of those trees. And I remember Papa Bruce, he would always, he'd laugh and joke and say, I'd get my 12 buckets done way before George. And then he'd want me to help him. I'd tell him, no, you got to get yours. So when they were young boys, and before Robertsdale was, near what it is now, they always talk about 59 was a dirt road and planting those trees. And every day he would make them. And I'm sure there was some parenting involved with that, a little bit of chores, some responsibility. But to be able to see those trees now, or that one tree still standing, and knowing that trees have roots, that's part of the roots of Baldwin County and Robertsdale that started. And, that's so unique and so interesting to me still. Along with, like she said, the dairy stories and the running, but that's something that is still a reminder, that's still there, that was there planted, I don't know, probably in the 40s or 50s. To put that in perspective, in 1946, whenever they moved there, and my daddy Bruce was 4, Uncle George was 6, and that's whenever that one oak tree now is 78 something years old. Anyway, very old and still.
Well, I remember the 2-story red brick house that sat off of Highway 59. The high school was not there back then. It was an open field.
And that was part of their land.
That was part of their
farmed.
land where they farmed. So,
speaking of the house on 59 and then the area where the high school, Robertsdale High School is now, and they farmed that, the land also wrapped around behind the Chevron station. There's a trailer park there now. That's where Daddy and Uncle George's little ponies got to stay, and their horses. That's where they had a little pasture right there, and that's where their horses stayed, was right there. And where Morgan's Ice is now,
yes.
Was part of the land that was farmed, and then in the late 40s, my granddaddy built that he built that building, and it was for the potato shed.
Okay.
The potato shed that he built, and it was right along the railroad tracks, of course, just down from the depot, but that was built for a potato shed, and that's why it's in cinder blocks, because he chose to do it in cinder blocks to help keep it cool versus what he had before, and everybody else, the potato shed's out of the wood.
Wow, because growing up myself here from just down the street at Summerdale, I remember what we called shipping season.
Yes.
And all those potatoes were lined up, and the big 18-wheelers, and you couldn't even drive down the road because they were so long. They stuck out into the highway. But that was the hustle and bustle, and
yes.
My memory, I guess, I was born in 1967, just right behind you. So in the 70s, that's when it was really booming.
Oh, it was.
And but this whole area is just really part of your heritage, and especially yours, Kyle, because you were able to reap the benefits of all their experience right here in Robertsdale. So tell me a little bit about the cattle farming and the stockyards. I know that they go back in that area.
The stockyard land was my granddaddy's as well.
Okay.
As well as just east of that, there's a strip mall that curves around 59 and 104. Mm-hmm. The stockyard land, some of the farmers got together because they had all this cattle, a lot of dairying. There was dairies all over Baldwin County back in the day. And they, in lieu of taking them off far to buy and sell, they got together and pulled in some of their own monies, and they built the stockyard, had the stockyard built, and and then through other avenues, I'm sure. But that stockyard was in business for 50. What was that year?
It was a while. I was running 50, and I was reading an article on one of these magazines that was published in 2008, and it's got a picture of Uncle George. And what's unique about Baldwin County is the soil. If we want to get down to it, what brought the cattle and the farming here was the rich land. Mm-hmm. And really what brought the cattle was the farming. You see, these farmers, they would raise these crops all year, right? And potatoes was big. Now we see a lot of cotton, peanuts, but it's the rich soil. Well, in the off time, and it's unique to hear my father-in-law. I live just down the road in Florida now, and we buy a lot of cattle out of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And one of the things that's unique to hear him talk about is how Robertsdale used to have the fat cattle. Now, what I mean when I say fat cattle is all the crops, or the crops that maybe don't get shipped off or what left over, that provides food for these cattle. So instead of wasting it, these farmers got the idea, and it started with the dairying, but then, we don't eat the dairy cows, don't process the dairy cows like we do the beef cattle. God gave us these good Angus and good Hereford and Charolais beef cows to eat, so why not use your land, utilize your land? So when they weren't farming, they'd plant winter grazing. Down here in the South, we do a lot of planting in the winter because our growing season is probably 10 months out of the year because the weather is so tropical. We get so much rain, the warm weather. So when these guys when they'd get their crops out of the field, instead of letting that land sit dormant, they'd replant it in winter grazing, and then they would utilize it in those months when there was no farming to be done. The cattle would come and eat, and they'd get big. And these order buyers would come from Tennessee, Mississippi, North Alabama, Florida. They would come to our little town of Robertsdale. And I believe the reason the stockyard was built in Robertsdale, and Robertsdale has this wonderful title, it's the hub city.
Yes.
Anymore, we have subdivisions and condos is what we grow. I remember Uncle George used to say that. But south of here, man, the cattle that would come from south, like the Bartle brothers in Alberta, the Kaisers out in Seminole, and so many more. I could go on and on listening to names. Those two just come to mind. they had to utilize their land. It was smart business, and it created, I read in that article, it said something over $50 or $80 million over those years at Robertsdale Livestock. You imagine the tax revenue, imagine the economic impact that farming and cattle had. And for my grandfather, my great-grandfather was he would have been a key element in getting all this started. He owned the land. He knew the avenue that the farming could bring for the cattle. So it would have been nice to have been a fly on the wall to hear that meeting when all these farmers got together. Hey guys, not only can we farm, we can grow these cattle. We've already got the dairy going, and then you had the train running right through here. It was just a wonderful avenue to take advantage of, like I said, the rich soil and the location that Robertsdale brought to Baldwin County.
Yeah.
I never thought about that with the cattle. I do know that growing up in the Summerdale area, which is part of the Central Baldwin area, that we always talked about that rich potato dirt, but it's good for cattle too. And so you are probably dead on right that this was why it really came around this area, because back in the day the population was not at the south end of this county, because my father-in-law, who's still alive, he's 91 years old, he said nobody could grow anything down there on that sand. Who wanted that sand down at the beach? But we do know the landscape of Baldwin County has changed as far as the types of industries that are here. Tourism is the goose that laid the golden egg. Yeah. But to lose this heritage, we wanted to make sure that we got these stories told, because I tell you, it just fascinates me. And tell me a little bit about the cowboy in them.
Well, the cowboy. So the dairy cattle that we had here when they were growing up, I spoke to an uncle yesterday, and he said when he came down and would stay the summer, it just about took him out. But that they young, and we're not even driving yet, would be turned loose to milk themselves during the summer. And they had 180 cattle that they milked here in Robertsdale, just on the other side of the tree.
And they didn't have those machines that did it back then.
No, they didn't at first. My granddaddy ended up getting that, and that didn't count the dry cattle. There was dry cows out to pasture, because they had to turned them out. The cows they different seasons, and they would turn them out for milking, and then they would calve and have the calves, and so they were turned like that. And then we did have the fat cattle, and we had hogs on the side as well, and all that went in the freezer. But they milked and those cows from the 30s until the late 60s, 67, 68. And my granddaddy bought, this is pretty unique, my granddaddy bought land in Alberta and a dairy barn that would hold and accommodate more dairy cattle. So they took all the cattle they had here when they were all in their early 20s, and everybody got every cousin. Daddy and Uncle George are two of 32 first cousins, and only about 5 of them were raised here. They were all raised here, except those 5, and everybody got on a horse, however small or big they were, and they had a cattle drive all the way to Alberta from here.
Wow.
And that was 68, 67, 68.
So Alberta is about 10 miles from here?
About 15.
About 15 miles.
And they did not have all the stock traders like they ended up getting and having then everybody going to the stockyard. They had small little trailers or something on the back of pickup trucks, where they would load a cow or two and go to the sale. So they had a cattle drive in their 20s. I know my Uncle George, one story he would talk about, taking him back down to when he was 5 years old. They had an uncle, Billy Robinson, and the fencing law, the stock law, that was in play, I guess around 1945, since he was born in 40. But he remembered out in the county, it wasn't instilled at that point.
Okay.
You didn't have to have that. And he went with his uncle
one time. Was that the free range still available?
For an all day, bringing in all the cattle in to be able to work the cattle. And he was sore, he said. It was a long day, but he remembered it well. No cattle, and how they had to go out and try to find and get them and bring them in. But they did then in their 20s take them to Alberta, and then in Alberta, that dairy being larger, that would hold 300 head of cattle twice a day they milked. And then there was the same number that was out to dry. Out in the dry pasture. And then they did have, again, the fat cattle that they would keep there and in Robertsdale. And the dairy production that they put out was massive. And they did that until 1977 when my granddaddy sold that dairy. Because Bruce and George fist fought. They never stopped fist fighting, and this is their 20s. They're around 24 and 26 whenever they started dairying in Alberta, because they still fist fought at the barn everywhere. Pawpaw separated them to their expertise, and Uncle George was over the dairy, and Daddy was over the farming. At that time, they farmed 580 acres here in Robertsdale, and whenever they took on Alberta, they farmed 1,200 acres in Alberta. So Bruce was over all that, and the mechanical, and the welding, and the fixing, and the just beating his head in the pavement, trying to get everything done before the rain would come or before the. And Uncle George then was 24/7, 3:30 in the morning, tearing out to here or Alberta, and I was over the dairy. Now there was other workers, of course. My granddaddy had other workers, and helping and doing. But that 24/7 job, really for both,
wow.
Was remarkable how they did and what they did. But because we had all this extra fat cattle and the hogs, and Papa would just give it away to family, whenever we would butcher things. And of course, Farm Fresh at a point then started, had that part to Farm Fresh's store, and so we went through Farm Fresh and used them to process all that meat. But my granddaddy took his garage again. We're here on Highway 59, the 2-story red brick home, and he enclosed part of the garage and had that foam insulation sprayed in, and he turned it into a walk-in deep freeze.
Wow.
And we would walk in, I remember it well, that was in the 80s, and when he did all that, we would walk in, turn and walk down a long hall, and there was bins, 4 rows of bins from the ground up, and that's where we put all this beef, and then the hog meat, the pork, and lots of vegetables. Well, boy, did we work. And corn, that was another big crop. Then in my day, corn and soybeans and wheat and ryegrass and everything that could be planted around the seasons in the year was. We started the cotton, and the peanuts came a little later, and then my family was not farming at that time, but that corn, we would have a 2-week corn putting up, and every mama brought their son and daughter over here to have to help, and we would take the bean truck, would go out into the corn field, and they would have 14 acres planted in the sweet corn, Silver Queen. Then, and we
That's
would have
the good kind.
We'd go down, and every time it was filled halfway, the bean truck, big bean truck, filled halfway, and then we'd come back under an oak tree, and that's where the process started: the shucking, the silking, and then water, rinsing it all down, and then it all got taken in tubs to my grandmother's house on 59, that red story, 2-story brick home, where a lot of the girl cousins. I had to be here in the field. And my sister and my cousin, Charlie Gates. But at Grandma's, then everything else happened there. All the blanching, the creaming, and they would cut off the cob and cream off the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
And cutting off the corn, creaming the corn, and then blanching, and then it would sit in tubs of cold water, and then move to the walk-in deep freeze. So it was a big process, and it lasted 2 full weeks, and you did not get out of that, no matter what.
Recently I was honored to be able to attend your Uncle George's funeral. And there was a big photo there of your Uncle George on a beautiful horse in his sheriff's posse uniform. And I remember parades in Baldwin County and that sheriff's posse, all those good-looking cowboys up on those horses. And tell me about your Uncle George and his days in the sheriff's posse.
Uncle George was one of several that were charter members of the Baldwin County Sheriff's Posse. And that was back when they were a working posse. They got called out and would jump just as fast as an ambulance might try to get away today, or get somewhere today, and would go to where incidents were happening. Folks with dementia that would get lost. He talked several times of different areas in the southern part of the county where it was really thick with woods still, and where folks got lost that were dementia related, little children that were lost. And they would go in because the horses could walk on through the briars and the stickers and the brush before just any person could. And they did a lot of that. I've heard him talk about a lot of stories that were really unique. And he stayed with it until they dissolved at a point, and he received a plaque from Sheriff Jimmy Johnson at that time for his years of service, as well as the others did too. And then our Sheriff Hoss Mack has started it back up. And at the point, Uncle George more than he cared to do anymore, because it hasn't been that long ago, and so Uncle George gave it to all the new folks. But we did go to a Baldwin County Commission meeting, and Sheriff Huey Hosmack had us to do that and had a proclamation for Uncle George, and that was very, very, very heart-wrenching for Uncle George. When we left there, he just teared up and talked all about the years and the days and how happy he was just for the thought of that. But that was very exciting. Hoss made that special because Uncle George still being alive when a lot of them had already passed that were charter members.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, tell me about the impact that these cowboys had on your son. And I mentioned when I got here, I said, growing up, of course, you and I grew up in the same time frame, and we heard the old song, "Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys." But what did we have happen here?
We had that happen. And we did not have the dairy or the farm anymore by 1991. And my son was born in 1990. But we did still have the remaining 25 acres that we have now, including the land that's adjacent, that in this the land that we're on now in this home. But we had an arena. And my son helped build the arena. And so that's where Kyle learned to ride and do all his cowboying.
Yeah, and also there's a gentleman in the community, he's a cousin, his name is Bo Campbell. That's where I started my steer wrestling career, which if anyone was to ask Bo where he learned, I think he would probably say my Uncle George had a large impact on that with him. And like Mom said, I always heard the stories about the dairy and the farm, didn't know much about it other than what Uncle George told me, but the dream was instilled in me then. I remember, starting out going to junior rodeos, going to 4-H shows and stuff, riding horses, and you want to do it, and you see it. And rodeo has really evolved now into almost a mainstream sport. And I'll fast forward. So going through high school, found out, you have an opportunity to have a scholarship. When Mom and Grandma, everybody wanted me to go to college. I wanted to also, but you can imagine all I wanted to do was rodeo. So hang on now, I've got a chance to get my school paid for, And like I said, this is something that a great uncle put in me at a very young age, the love of horses. And I was able to go through college, it paid for my school, and get a degree. And my college coach told me towards the end of it, he said, you have the talent to maybe take this to the professional level. And you always want to believe in yourself and think you do, but that's a large stage from somebody from South Alabama. All these rodeos, Oklahoma, Texas. I just flew in from California to one, Oregon, Washington, the last months where I've been. You don't get to come home much unless you live out there. So it was a lot. It was a big step for me whenever I was 18, leaving Robertsdale to go out, and to pursue these dreams. But nonetheless, I learned how to ride, I learned how to rope, I learned how to steer wrestle right here in really Rosington, Alabama, if we want to get technical, at Mr. Herman Murphy's house. He was a good friend of my granddaddy and my great uncle. Many stories between those two. I found a cool picture the other day of me and Chris Murphy, Mr. Herman's grandson. We graduated high school together, been best friends for a long time, and we were riding a pony at his granddad's machine shop when we were 3 and 4 years old. And like you said about the pictures at the funeral, man, it brought back so many memories of getting to go with him, getting to watch and see the way that he conducted his life through the farming, through the cattle that came from Baldwin County, that came from Robertsdale, this area. So that was always very special to me, and it always will be. Now my son wants to be a cowboy, and you can't tell me that that's not pretty neat to see it passed down generation to generation. And it started with Uncle George. He would always tell me with the dairy, not just penning the cattle to milk them, but the sick ones. If there was a sick one in the pasture that couldn't make it to the barn, he had to rope him and doctor him in the pasture. If there was a cow trying to have a calf in the pasture and she couldn't on her own, you had to act then. With a horse, you couldn't. Nowadays we have a lot of trucks and four-wheelers, and it's changed a lot, but still horseback is the best way to work cattle, to know and watch him, the way he worked around animals and the way that, his patience and just his demeanor around them kept everything calm. The situation always stayed relaxed. If it ever did get out of control, I think it was through just all his expertise. And they say good experience comes from making bad decisions. Well, I don't know if I ever saw my Uncle George make bad decisions around cattle, because he just knew the job that needed to be done. That's how he paid the bills for so long, was through tending to other people's cattle, tending to his father's cattle. So to see like we talked about, the heritage that got brought to Robertsdale when all these people came, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they all came here from somewhere. To see that passed down through him, and then he had a great uncle that was always very dear to him. His name was Billy Robinson. He lived in Demopolis, Alabama, and he had a big ranch up there, a lot of cows. And Uncle George would always tell me about going and working with him when he was young. The stock law story Mom told you was with Uncle Billy. That was who Uncle George went with. And I remember he would always talk about that, how he handled horses, how he handled cattle. And so to see that passed down, and you talked about it at Uncle George's funeral. And I remember one of the things I said there was his patience, knowing when to react, what to do, and just to not back down. That's things that you never would think that I would instill into my life, that'd come into my life from watching a man work, doing his everyday deal. So that was always, and that will always be something I'll cherish. I don't really see myself making a living any other way than through cattle, horses, and agriculture. And to be able to do that, is pretty neat, and it's pretty special to me.
I think it's neat, and I'm so happy that the people of Baldwin County will have this living history video to commemorate, your Uncle George and your daddy and all the Campbells. I mean, there's a lot of, when you think of rodeos and cowboys, the Campbell name pops up, and I hope that some of the people will be able to never forget when we drive down Highway 59, that wasn't always retail stores and a high school and things like that.